Frank. Just want to thank everyone for joining in person, as well as, since I know this is recorded, those of you who have reached out to me to let me know you saw the show, that you're looking forward to the catalog, that you've brought your students. It is really with the intention of being able to share, even for those of us who knew Bonnie and her work, a lot more about her work with a greater range of people. And it's such a pleasure that the show was able to open in San Francisco, where Bonnie, for several decades, produced work, was deeply involved in many communities, including the artist communities here. And the last time I saw Bonnie, it was in February 2020. It was right before the pandemic, and she had called me up to let me know that she had transferred some films, films in particular that I had been asking about when 5 years prior, Christian Frock and I had guest curated a show for Mills College Art Museum focused on women working in public space through temporary gestures, and Bonnie's Sitting Still was the earliest work in that show, and was also, as she put it, she was our cover girl for that catalog. But she had also done, in addition to the slide projection version that you see here in the galleries, she had also had, Vicente Saval had filmed a short film at the zoo of her, as well as Pacing, Public Lunch. There were also personal films that she had transferred. One I loved of her father wrinkling his nose, imitating a bunny. And as we were walking out the door, Bonnie was sharing with me all of the shows she was in. She was in exhibitions in Spain and in Portugal, in conversation for the Liverpool Biennial, and I was just so excited for her, because the Bonnie I knew as someone who had gone to graduate school here in the Bay Area had really benefited from various resurgences of interest and scholarship and curiosity about work, in particular from experimental practices from the 70s. At the time when I was at CCA, there was the founding of the Social Practice Department by Ted Purvis, and there was then a sort of younger generations who were looking at examples like her social artworks, like The Farm, and Bonnie would lecture, and she was also in key exhibitions of performance and feminism and environmental art, including Karen Moss's wonderful State of Mind, New California Art, circa 1970 with Constance Llewellyn. But then I'm always also aware that there are people who I meet who have not heard of Bonnie, who maybe only know certain works, and so it's really with the desire beyond the life of this exhibition, and what I hope our catalog can do is just to encourage more people to write about Bonnie, to lecture about Bonnie, to teach your students about her work, and to create more shows. But I was always interested in thinking with Bonnie through not only just how she described what she called the evolution of her life frames, but how someone can represent temporary work in a gallery context, work that was in public, how Bonnie, who would say things like, early in my career, I wasn't thinking about shows, I wasn't thinking of a career, and at the same time, there's a lot of really wonderful examples from her proposals decorated with decals and stickers to documentation that she would exhibit alongside performance, that she was thinking about the sort of challenge of thinking about performance. Sitting Still series, and this first Sitting Still one that she did as sort of her first personal work in public. It's the same year she graduated from San Francisco State University, then San Francisco State College. And she sees this kind of surreal scene of a flooded area by the freeway, which was at the time the construction for what would then become by 73 the interchange. And she goes with a photographer friend, Robert Campbell, to photograph her sitting in a formal gown. And it's a piece that starts questioning, well, who is the performer, who's the audience? What does it mean to simply transform a space by being present in it? It was also a work that would then have feminist implications in terms of how she would think of, in all of the different locations in San Francisco, including the Golden Gate Bridge, which we have a view of from here, to be a sort of woman on view. Bonnie is facing the location that later becomes Crossroads Community, which she named because she was bringing together diverse communities for neighborhoods that had been sort of physically or symbolically severed by the interchange, as well as then realizing that this was, as she put it, my watershed piece, all puns intended, because she's sitting in the floodwater of the Islayas Creek watershed, and the watershed would become a defining force in her work with the Living Library. There was also 3 creeks that were underneath the area of the farm, and it was her original vision for the kind of city farm park that the city would buy, was that it would use the kind of natural resources that even recycling the concrete could then create a kind of landscape there. And Bonnie, in her time, at the moment that she's creating the farm, is also starting to write about it. She's starting to exhibit it. We have really charming video documentation of one of the classes from the farm coming to see her show at the old San Francisco Art Institute campus on Chestnut, and encountering the kinds of photos you see in the gallery. Bonnie would often, though, in more recent years, also was really interested in how, if you're going to look at that example, that you also look at a living library, that this kind of history of working with communities and with youth over time. For me, with Bonnie, was also to think about ways in which she starts being in dialogue with, initially with some of her peers who were coming to the fore in the 70s, both in Northern and Southern California. For example, in response, she has an invitation to go down to San Diego, and this is an event in which she discovers the kind of, in this new sort of library building being created, that there's these undeveloped landscape area pits. And so to create a performance that is viewed by the audience from both above and sort of directly, but that also to have the observations of her activities documented in photography, documented in video, that you have also a biologist and physicist who are observing her. And so what are all of the different interpretations being part of the work? Later, when she first develops the idea of a living library in Bryant Park, creates what she called a sort of mini demonstration installation. This was in 2 different venues, and Robert Kroonquist, who will speak later today, was part of that project in terms of the students who were engaged with it. She also engaged NYU Telecommunications Department to have a sort of interactive video disc. There was computer graphics. She was looking at gardens around the world. And this EUC is something that reappears through a number of works interested in sort of aligning works with the kind of access, northwest, southeast, and a gallery being in sort of in relation to the world. I first sort of learned about Bonnie through sort of my professional work as one of the many artists who had intersected with San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's history, but it was really through a sort of core group initially of artists who had been associated with the kind of rise of conceptual art and performance, especially around Tom Marioni, the one looking at the camera in the center there, and his Museum of Conceptual Art in San Francisco, which was founded in March of 1970. And if we say MoCA in the panel, that is what I'm referring to. And really the kind of creating a peer-oriented situation for artists to create often really event-based work coming out of sculpture. Bonnie has spoken of just the the importance of finding these sort of like-minded individuals and a kind of context for that work at the time. This is a flyer of a show that Tom then actually guest curated in Southern California, a video which I've shown in the past, in which she is then taking some of her explorations that had been in the studio around animal behavior and intelligence and creating a sort of in-gallery installation of that. But it was always in thinking of Tom in particular, the idea that these were artists who were very interested in also being part of a larger dialogue. Patricia used the term global thinker for Bonnie. I think a number of these artists were also, when possible, and we're seeing perhaps more recently, being in dialogue through print publications, through performances, through exhibitions with their peers elsewhere. So many of them were really critical to my thinking about how you could make work from your own experiences through everyday life, as well as really taking on exciting alternative or creative exhibition models. Bonnie is invited by the De Sausset Art Gallery and Museum at Santa Clara University in 1973 to do a pretty ambitious installation as part of a show called The Four with 4 women artists. And in Bonnie's case, this is a 6-week installation in which it's a piece that the public could come and view, but it's also one that embraces change. She's observing and writing on the walls. She's looking at the animals that are living in this space with her, with trees. And a key aspect being that she was also recording it on video. George Bowling at the De Sausset Art Gallery was the first institutional video curator on the West Coast, but he also, as an artist and videographer himself, was really key in filming a lot of the early videos of artists like Howard Fried and Terry Fox and Paul Koss, who were in that prior slide, and worked with Bonnie as well. By the end of the decade, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art organizes a big survey of 22 artists who had kind of come out of, in particular, a kind of sculpture approach to thinking of conceptual art and performance. And Bonnie is one of them who, yes, there was sort of photographic documentation of a few key pieces, but she's also creates then this sort of really major installation documentation version then of Living in the Forest. And this is something I remember our former head of installation, Ken Roberts, talking about. This was like one of his first shows that he worked on, and I think in the opening, the rooster killed the rabbit, or I mean, it was some sort of drama. It's still very hard to believe that SFMOMA would have, animals in the gallery, but it's one that she would also, through different shows, always think about how could you bring in living elements, her own presence as well, and it's something that has been really interesting to think about, sort of that kind of history that Bonnie had there. Living in the forest, Bonnie often talked about, was sort of directly informed the work she then did at the farm, in particular in creating something called the Raw Egg Animal Theater, or TREAT. I hadn't thought about experiments in art and technology and EAT until you noted it. I may not be related, but in which you could create non-hierarchical exchanges between animals of different species, between children and adults, and really pushing always this idea of a life theater and life work. Her relationship to the children of the farm, I think, is also very evident in her way of sharing photography, and examples of which we have on view in the exhibition. Bonnie, in her old CVs from the 70s, lists not only her formal education, noting Rutgers and San Francisco State University, but she also then says recent education. She talks about running a corporation. She lists how she is sort of interacting with different government structures, that she is a performance of being, and then talking with Black Flash, the Lady Doe, and Sarah Davis. Sarah Davis, who is the little girl with the chicken in that installation, whose father, Jack Davis, was really key with a number of arts programs in the Bay Area, Intersection for the Arts, Neighborhood Arts Program, and SOMA Arts, which we'll hear later from Maria Jensen today. The farm for Bonnie and the importance of this space that she, in collaboration with Jack Wickard, founded was really, I think, about an ideas of a kind of inclusive and diverse model, and one that she often spoke of bridging the divisions that also existed between the visual art and performing arts communities. That this was also something that had at any given moment simultaneous activities, but it was also for her a social artwork in and of itself. It was where she got her PhD in life, and this was from that show that SFMOMA had done at the end of the decade. This was a kind of photo montage that she created of writing she had done, of letters that people sent into the city to get the city to buy the acres for a new park, and some of the key ideas. She had gotten successfully a grant for an alternative to alternative art spaces of what the farm was. The farm had hosted something that we have just in the vitrine, a little document called the Floating Seminar, in which 12 different non-commercial spaces and publishing, artist-run publishing imprints in the Bay Area all convened in 1975. That sort of legacy of not only its own history, but being a host for other spaces at the time was really key. And part of this image is her Center for Critical Inquiry paper that was given in the 1977 Symposium organized by the San Francisco Art Institute. We've republished that in the catalog. It is profoundly bittersweet to be in the space of the Art Institute in thinking of that. I will also note that as part of the catalog, we have a wonderful essay that we've republished by Jana Blankenship about the farm and its histories, had come out of directly her time here in the Bay Area, knowing Bonnie and interviewing her extensively for her thesis at the CCA Curatorial Practice Program. Both of us are alums from that program, which is closing this spring. And I think while none of us think of ourselves, and even Bonnie, as necessarily coming out of just our education background, there was a real respect and passion and commitment of that program to artist-run spaces history. And so this symposium is touching on that today. Thanks.